Gurdjieff, the mystic wanderer and the quest for hidden truth. Prologue: A flicker of music in Alexandropol. George Ivanovich Gurdjieff was, by many accounts, born in the late 19th century. Most sources suggest January 13, 1866 or January 14, 1872, with Gurdjieff himself never entirely clarifying, in Alexandropol, a frontier town in what is now Gyumri, Armenia. In those days, Alexandropol existed as a tapestry of crossroads between Europe and Asia, shaped by the ebb and flow of the Russo-Turkish wars, bustling trade caravans, and the ceaseless interplay of diverse ethnic groups. On a cold and star-kissed night, the wind swirling eddies of dust around the ramshackle houses, a small cry was heard in the home of a Greek father, Ivan, or sometimes Yevdokim, and an Armenian mother, Evdokia. Their newborn son would be named Georgi, but in time he would be known to the world as Gurdjieff, a teacher who would travel far in search of hidden knowledge and eventually return to awaken others to paths rarely trodden. From the moment of his birth, as he later described in his autobiographical reflections, Gurdjieff's environment teemed with songs, stories, and ancient legends. His father was a skilled ashok or bard, a man who carried within him the storied traditions of Caucasian minstrels, recounting epic poetry and folk tales of heroism, cunning, and spiritual longing. These lullabies, sung in a variety of languages, from Armenian to Greek to Russian, imbued Gurdjieff with an insatiable curiosity about the nature of man, the soul, and the invisible forces binding us all. This biography unfolds like one of those epic sagas, traveling the length and breadth of Gurdjieff's life, from the dusty courtyards of his childhood home to the sacred mountaintops of Asia, and eventually to the grand salons of Europe where he would disseminate his teachings. It is a story not just of one man's odyssey, but of the work he created, a tapestry woven from threads of ancient traditions, fused into something profoundly new. Chapter 1: Echoes from a Childhood in the Caucasus. From a young age, George listened intently to the music and poetry that his father played. In his family's parlor, simple rugs covered the floors, and there was often a smell of bread baking in the small clay oven nearby. His father, sitting with a stringed instrument in hand, would sing verses about kings and warriors, or solemn funeral songs that spoke of the fragility of life. Gurdjieff's mother came from a devout Christian background, which brought him early exposure to the local Orthodox churches. Yet Alexandropol was not a quiet backwater. It was filled with the bustling trade of a border city. Horses, oxen, and donkey caravans moved along cobblestone streets, delivering goods from Persia, Turkey, and beyond. The mix of peoples, Armenians, Russians, Georgians, Persians, and Greeks, ensured that the local languages were many and the customs even more varied. This was the kaleidoscopic environment in which Gurdjieff formed his first impressions of the world. As a boy, George often accompanied his father to gatherings of local storytellers and performers. The memory of sitting cross-legged on a woven carpet, wide-eyed, while traveling bards exchanged stories and debated points of tradition under flickering lamplight, would remain with him forever. He would later recount how these early experiences inoculated him with the desire to seek something beyond mundane life, something intangible, hidden in the continuum of human experience. The extraordinary incident of the ruined workshop. One day, when George was still quite small, his father took him to a workshop near the outskirts of Alexandropol. The workshop belonged to an elderly man who built and repaired musical instruments. On that particular day, a sudden riot broke out nearby. Some violent quarrel that led to looting and chaos. Windows shattered in the workshop and the old craftsman panicked. George saw in a moment that left an indelible mark on him, the old man gather a handful of his finest instruments, almost as if saving them from a greater conflagration. His father calmly helped the craftsman push a workbench against the broken window to prevent further damage. In the midst of this chaos, George observed how his father remained centered. Fear did not overcome him. Instead, he responded with a combination of compassion and measured strength, aiding a neighbor in distress. Although Gurdjieff never mentioned this specific incident in his writings, it was precisely the type of early life experience he described more broadly in meetings with remarkable men, formative moments of witnessing the interplay of various human qualities, fear, anger, compassion, and resilience. Even from this young age, Gurdjieff seemed aware that human beings did not always live in harmony with themselves or with their environment. A feeling emerged that something was amiss in the way people knew themselves and each other, and that the mechanicalness of human reactions could lead to such turmoil. This spark, observing real events in the context of old legends and deeper yearnings, would grow steadily within him. Chapter 2: Early Educational Influences and Mentors. By the time Gurdjieff was a boy of 8 or 9, the family recognized that he had a restless and inquiring mind. He began studies under the guidance of local priests, as was common in the region, with a focus on scripture and church music. Later, he attended the Kars Military Cathedral School, where he came under the tutelage of Dean Borsch, a devout and learned figure who introduced him to readings beyond standard religious texts. According to Meetings with Remarkable Men, Gurdjieff also studied under Father Evlissi, a man of deep spirituality who helped widen the young boy's horizons. Yet Gurdjieff did not stop at religious instruction. He developed a fascination for biology, chemistry, and geology when he encountered them through visiting physicians and scholars in Alexandropol. He peppered them with questions about the nature of life, consciousness, and the origins of the cosmos. Occasionally he got into trouble for neglecting more mundane studies in favor of searching out secret passages in old manuscripts or rummaging through second-hand bazaars to find esoteric books. The Enigma of the Pythagorean Manuscript. One of the more famous anecdotes Gurdjieff related in Meetings with Remarkable Men was the discovery of certain esoteric texts, including something purportedly containing the secrets of Pythagoras' teachings. He found this manuscript, so the story goes, hidden in the dusty recesses of a local merchant's chest. While it's uncertain how much of the story is literal and how much might be embellished, Gurdjieff always maintained that this pivotal find fueled his conviction that there existed an ancient chain of wisdom teachings. That chain, he believed, transcended nations, religions, and time itself. Though his formal schooling was sporadic, he would attend classes for a time and then leave on extended trips. Gurdjieff's real education came from scouting the cross-cultural tapestry of the Caucasus. He spent days in hidden corners of monasteries, local mosques, and even in the company of Eastern merchants who shared cryptic legends of remote dervish orders. His acquaintances and mentors, among them men like Boguchevsky, the pseudo-Baptist, each contributed some piece of knowledge or a clue to the reality Gurdjieff sensed was just beyond common perception. Chapter 3: The Caravan of Seekers and the First Journeys. In his adolescence, Gurdjieff formed a close-knit circle of friends, sometimes referred to in Meetings with Remarkable Men as the Seekers of Truth. This band included individuals of varying backgrounds, an Armenian prince, a Russian doctor, a Persian dervish, and other intriguing personalities who likewise felt a burning desire to probe the mysteries of existence. Their camaraderie revolved around a single unifying goal: to find the latent wisdom traditions that promised a deeper self-knowledge and a meaningful understanding of life's purpose. Searching the ruins of Ani. One of the earliest group excursions took them to the ancient city of Ani, once the flourishing capital of the medieval Armenian kingdom, now a majestic ruin perched near the Turkish border. There, among the broken arches and collapsed walls of centuries-old cathedrals, the seekers of truth scoured the ground for archaeological clues. Gurdjieff suspected that hidden in these ruins were secret texts, or at least vestiges of knowledge that could point to advanced civilizations whose spiritual achievements outstripped modern societies. According to Gurdjieff's accounts, the ruins of Ani were a profound backdrop for their philosophical discussions. While the biting wind whipped through empty doorways and howling dogs wandered among debris, the group debated the nature of the soul, the fall of civilizations, and whether there was a universal teaching that might have once unified humanity. Though they found no conclusive treasure, the emotional resonance of Ani's silent presence fueled their conviction. A strange meeting with a wandering dervish. As the group left Ani, they encountered a lone dervish who seemed to materialize out of the shifting shadows at twilight. He introduced himself not by name, but by a cryptic title that Gurdjieff later refused to reproduce, stating only that the man possessed an air of calm authority. The dervish recited lines from a Sufi poem and spoke in riddles about an ancient brotherhood said to dwell in a hidden valley. He cautioned the seekers about seeking knowledge prematurely. One must first prepare oneself inwardly before grasping universal truths. Though the dervish vanished as mysteriously as he arrived, the group felt as though they had been visited by a harbinger. The mention of an ancient brotherhood sparked in Gurdjieff the dream that there indeed existed a continuous esoteric tradition, kept alive by secret orders in remote places, only revealing themselves to worthy seekers. Chapter 4. The Quest for the Samong Brotherhood. Undeterred and ever more inspired, Gurdjieff and his comrades set off in search of legendary brotherhoods. One name that repeatedly surfaced in whispers was the Samong Brotherhood, a sect rumored to safeguard ancient esoteric knowledge, possibly dating back to Babylonian or even pre-Babylonian times. In the mid to late 1890s, the exact years are somewhat murky, Gurdjieff undertook extensive travels through Central Asia, the Middle East, and parts of North Africa. His itinerary, as reconstructed from meetings with remarkable men and corroborated in broad strokes by some of his pupils, included stops in Bukhara and Samarkand in present-day Uzbekistan, famed for their storied Islamic scholarship and mesmerizing architecture, Persia, Iran, where he mingled with scholars versed in Sufi mysticism and Persian philosophy, Tibet, or at least Tibet's borderlands, where he reputedly sought out Buddhist monasteries. The Gobi Desert, one of the more mythical corners of his journey, where some claim he encountered wandering ascetics and shamans. During these explorations, Gurdjieff collected a staggering range of impressions, ritual dances, cryptic manuscripts, healing methods, and psychic phenomena. Despite the romance and mystique surrounding his accounts, they highlight a practical side. Gurdjieff labored as a carpenter, a fortune teller, and even a hypnotist to earn funds. He wrote at times of being near destitute, subsisting on sparse rations in remote regions, all for the sake of the search. Encounter with the monastery in Central Asia. Among the more intriguing episodes Gurdjieff described was his sojourn at a remote monastery, possibly hidden in the Pamir Mountains or near the Afghan border. He never made the location explicit. There he found a group that combined Eastern Orthodox rites with esoteric traditions drawn from the East. He listened to their chanting and observed their body movements in communal ceremonies. They taught him certain exercises that he claimed unified mind, body, and spirit in a single flow of focused attention. Years later, these movements would become the basis of what Gurdjieff called sacred dances, or Gurdjieff movements, which he introduced in Europe as a core aspect of his spiritual teaching. This ephemeral fusion of dance, meditation, and psychological discipline had its roots, at least in part, in the processes he witnessed and practiced during those far-flung travels. Did he find the Samong Brotherhood? While Gurdjieff writes tantalizingly about encountering a branch of the Samong Brotherhood, the details remain oblique. He speaks of meeting elders who instructed him in advanced cosmological ideas and practices for self-remembering, maintaining an inner awareness even amid the flux of daily life. Whether this brotherhood was a literal group, a composite of various esoteric schools, or a purely symbolic representation of hidden knowledge, remains a topic of debate among scholars. Nevertheless, the transformative outcome is clear. These journeys shaped Gurdjieff's conviction that a universal ancient wisdom was alive in scattered enclaves, and that it needed to be reintroduced to the modern West in a form accessible to contemporary seekers. Chapter 5. Return to Russia and the Seeds of a Teaching. By the early 1900s, Gurdjieff found himself back in Russian territories, at times in Tiflis, now Tbilisi, Georgia, and later in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He was accompanied by a handful of companions, having lost some of his earlier fellow seekers to the natural divergences of life. He also gained new followers along the way. It was in Tiflis that Gurdjieff began publicly demonstrating what he had learned. He opened informal gatherings to introduce novices to practices of self-observation and to the idea that man existed largely in a state of sleep. People from all walks of life, students, intellectuals, military officers, sat in cramped rooms listening to this bearded traveler recount fables of hidden monasteries, whirling dervishes, and the dramatic difference between man's essence and his personality. Gurdjieff also showcased impressive abilities that bordered on the miraculous. He healed ailments through unorthodox methods, displayed feats of hypnotism, and performed subtle manipulations of energy, leading some skeptics to label him a charlatan. Yet, to many others, he demonstrated an undeniable magnetism and knowledge that transcended conventional understanding. Key principles of Gurdjieff's emerging teaching. Man's mechanicalness. Gurdjieff observed that human beings mostly live automatically, reacting to external events with little true awareness. He compared people to machines, subject to countless influences, lacking a stable eye. Self-observation and self-remembering. One of Gurdjieff's foundational practices involved teaching pupils to observe themselves objectively. Simultaneously, one had to remember oneself, to cultivate a state of conscious presence instead of drifting in daydreams. The many eyes. Gurdjieff taught that we have not one eye but many small eyes or sub-personalities, each taking control at different times based on triggers and habits. True selfhood required forging a permanent eye through disciplined inner work. Centers. He posited that humans possess various centers of functioning: intellectual, emotional, physical, and so on. Most people's centers are out of balance. Work must be done to develop them harmoniously. The possibility of awakening. While man is mechanical by default, Gurdjieff claimed there is the potential to break free from this hypnotic state, to awaken to higher levels of consciousness, akin to glimpsing the world through a different dimension. These concepts were not to remain mere theories. Gurdjieff insisted on practical exercises. His sessions included everything from rhythmic movements, special breathing practices, group discussions, where he shocked pupils out of complacent thinking, and unusual tasks designed to test one's self-awareness under stress. Over time, a small but dedicated group around him grew. Chapter 6: War, Revolution, and the Search for a New Base. The tumultuous events of the early 20th century, World War I, 1914-1918, the Russian Revolution, 1917, and civil strife, threw Gurdjieff and his followers into a whirlwind. He first attempted to set up a more formal Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in Tiflis, but political upheaval forced him to relocate. He ended up leading a caravan of pupils, Russians of various backgrounds, across the Caucasus Mountains in perilous journeys, dodging conflict and revolution. Eventually, Gurdjieff moved to Constantinople, now Istanbul, around 1920. There, he temporarily established a center for his teaching, attracting both émigrés fleeing Russia and curious Westerners who had heard rumors of an exotic teacher with extraordinary knowledge. Not long after, he decided to move westward again, eyeing Europe as the new frontier for his work. Encounter with P.D. Ouspensky. Before leaving Russia, Gurdjieff had encountered P.D. Ouspensky, a noted Russian philosopher and journalist. Ouspensky had already made a name for himself with works on esotericism, most notably Tertium Organum. He was spellbound by Gurdjieff's ideas. Their collaboration deepened when they both arrived in Europe, and Ouspensky, in turn, wrote about Gurdjieff's teachings in Search of the Miraculous. That book, though published only after Gurdjieff and Ouspensky had parted ways, would become one of the principal conduits of Gurdjieff's ideas to the Western intelligentsia. Passage to Europe. With the situation in the Near East still turbulent, Gurdjieff sought a stable environment to realize his bold dream: a permanent institute dedicated to the harmonious development of a human being. In 1922, he found it. Through the help of patrons and wealthy students, he purchased the Château du Prieuré in Fontainebleau-Avon, on the outskirts of Paris, France. Chapter 7: The Institute at the Prieuré and the Gurdjieff Movements. At the Prieuré, Gurdjieff laid the foundation for what might be considered his central experiment with a living school. The sprawling estate included a main house, outbuildings, wooded areas, and gardens. Pupils, who came from all over Europe and even America, lived, worked, and studied together under Gurdjieff's often challenging guidance. Daily life at the prieuré. Physical labor. Students rose early to tend the gardens, fix up the property, and work in the kitchens. This was not merely for practical upkeep, but was also considered part of the inner work, observing and overcoming mechanical habits while engaged in everyday tasks. Gurdjieff's movements. A large salon was converted into a studio for the sacred dances or Gurdjieff movements. These structured dances featured precise postures and gestures, often set to music composed by Gurdjieff in collaboration with his student Thomas de Hartmann. The movements aimed to engage the body, emotions, and mind simultaneously. Pupils had to maintain an inner presence while executing complex sequences, thus training their attention. Dialogue and lectures. In the evenings, Gurdjieff would gather pupils for readings or impromptu talks. He tested their self-conceptions, forced them to confront their ingrained patterns, and offered cryptic but potent advice. Many described these sessions as highly transformative, though at times psychologically grueling. Shock tactics. Gurdjieff frequently used shocks to break a student's habitual sense of self. He might berate a student publicly or give contradictory orders to push them to discover a deeper resource of presence. Such methods provoked controversy. Some hailed them as a new pedagogy in spiritual development, while others criticized them as harsh or manipulative. Despite the rigorous regime, the prieuré was also a place of celebration and festivity. Gurdjieff believed in the value of good food, music, and a healthy sense of humor as integral to human development. Legendary feasts were held, during which students were encouraged to eat, drink, and observe themselves in the swirl of social interaction. Collaboration with de Hartmann. Music as a spiritual aid. Gurdjieff's collaboration with the Russian composer Thomas de Hartmann bore fruit in the form of the Gurdjieff-de Hartmann music, hauntingly evocative melodies, often based on Eastern themes, and used extensively to accompany the movements. Pupils attested to the music's unique power to awaken certain emotional and psychological states conducive to self-remembering. Chapter 8. Beelzebub's Tales and the Writings of Gurdjieff. While presiding over the school in France, Gurdjieff devoted considerable energy to writing. His magnum opus, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, forms the first volume of his trilogy All and Everything. Written in a dense, at times convoluted style, Beelzebub's Tales presents an elaborate cosmological narrative. Framed as advice an extraterrestrial being, Beelzebub gives to his grandson about life on Earth and the foibles of mankind. Gurdjieff's purpose in writing such a challenging text was, he claimed, to destroy, mercilessly, all the beliefs and views rooted in the psyche of man. In other words, the style itself was part of the teaching, requiring the reader to engage actively, struggle with meaning, and thus not remain a passive recipient of information. Subsequent volumes, Meetings with Remarkable Men and Life is Real Only Then, When I Am, further detailed his personal journey and teaching approach. Meetings with Remarkable Men, published in 1963, remains the most accessible of Gurdjieff's writings, providing engaging vignettes of the figures who influenced him. Chapter 9. Transformations, Crises, and Renewal. While the 1920s saw Gurdjieff at the height of his influence in Europe, attracting intellectual luminaries such as Catherine Hulme, Jane Heap, and the poet Margaret Anderson, a tragic car accident in 1924 nearly claimed his life. Gurdjieff was severely injured, and the recovery period forced him to reassess his activities. He dramatically reorganized the institute, eventually closing the prieuré as a formal school. Brief retirement and further writing. In the years immediately following the accident, Gurdjieff turned inward, focusing on his writings. He continued to meet privately with selected pupils, but he ceased the broad-based teaching that had characterized the early 1920s. Some students, including Ouspensky, drifted away or tried to establish their own groups, sometimes in tension with Gurdjieff's new direction. Still, Gurdjieff remained an imposing figure. Visitors to his Paris flat in the 1930s described him as an enigmatic presence, occupying a simple room, often wearing a robe or Eastern-style clothing, making strong coffee for his guests while peppering them with riddles or sudden insights about their inner state. Chapter 10: World War II and the Later Gatherings. With the onset of World War II, Paris fell under German occupation. Gurdjieff, by then an older man, continued living discreetly in the city. Despite the hardships, rationing, blackouts, and the constant fear of bombings, he continued to meet with small groups, giving them practical exercises and tasks to maintain inner work amidst the turmoil of wartime life. When bombs fell or sirens wailed, Gurdjieff would remind his pupils to remember themselves and observe the mechanical reactions of fear or panic. The war, grim as it was, became a crucible in which his followers tested the mettle of the teaching. By the war's end, many notable figures in arts, literature, and science had come into contact with Gurdjieff, either in person or through the network of smaller study groups in London, New York, and other cities. Though his main base remained Paris, Gurdjieff occasionally travelled, offering demonstrations of his movements and quietly supporting the growth of new centres. Chapter 11: Final Years and Legacy. Gurdjieff's health waned in the late 1940s, yet he showed remarkable determination, continuing to see pupils up until his final days. He made a series of visits to New York City in the late 1940s to early 1950s, drawing an ever-growing circle of Americans eager to partake in his teachings. Stories abound of Gurdjieff holding court in restaurants, ordering lavish meals, and forcing pupils to remain alert while juggling an onslaught of plates, toasts, and conversations in multiple languages, again using everyday experiences as a means of teaching presence. On October 29, 1949, Gurdjieff died in the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine near Paris. His funeral took place at the Church of the Russian Cemetery at Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois. Pupils from many countries attended, paying homage to a man who had profoundly altered their perspective on existence. Who took up the mantle? After his death, a core group of pupils, Jeanne de Salzmann being the most prominent, took up the stewardship of Gurdjieff's work. They preserved and disseminated his movements, published his writings, and organized study groups worldwide. These groups, often known simply as Gurdjieff Foundations or The Work, carried forward the practices of self-observation, self-remembering, and the movements. Over time, different lineages and interpretations emerged, sometimes giving rise to controversies about authentic versus derivative teachings. Nevertheless, the unifying strand remained Gurdjieff's core principle, that human beings possess untapped capacities for higher consciousness, which must be developed through conscious effort and guidance. Chapter 12: Core Themes of Gurdjieff's Legacy. Reflecting on Gurdjieff's influence, one might focus on several key themes that permeate his teaching. Inner work in real life. Gurdjieff insisted that spiritual work was not reserved for monastic settings, nor was it to be based on mere intellectual speculation. Instead, real life, its stresses, demands, and interpersonal frictions, provided the laboratory for awakening. Integration of mind, body, and feeling. He introduced a notion of three-centered, and at times four-centered existence, emphasizing that intellectual insight alone was insufficient. One needed to feel with the heart, move with the body, and think with the mind, all in a unified manner. Sacred art. Gurdjieff viewed art as a vessel for higher truths. Whether through music, dance, or architecture, art could convey objective knowledge that impacted individuals at deep layers of their psyche. Not a religion. While some critics labeled him the leader of a cult, Gurdjieff eschewed the notion of starting a new religion. He instead presented a fourth way, a path of inner transformation that required no cloistering from the world, unlike the historically recognized ways of the monk, the yogi, and the fakir. Effort and self-reliance. Above all, Gurdjieff placed responsibility on the individual. No one could do the work for another. He offered guidance, but the labor was each student's to undertake, step by painstaking step. Chapter 13: The Enigma and the Criticisms. For all his intellectual brilliance and spiritual depth, Gurdjieff was not without controversies. Critics found fault with his lifestyle, his at times abrasive teaching methods, and the swirling aura of secrecy and theatricality that surrounded him. Some dismissed his accounts of travels as outright fabrications or gross exaggerations. Even sympathetic pupils admitted that Gurdjieff could be perplexing, notoriously difficult to pin down. A significant point of debate remains the degree to which Gurdjieff's teachings were original. Some claim he synthesized existing traditions, Sufism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Tibetan Buddhism, yogi practices, and reframed them for Western audiences. Others, including Gurdjieff himself, argued that he was merely reviving a knowledge older than recorded history, universal in scope, and lost to mainstream culture. Nonetheless, a balanced view suggests that, regardless of the ultimate origins, Gurdjieff's unique method of presentation and personal magnetism forged a new approach to esoteric work. The shock tactics, the use of group work, the emphasis on embodying knowledge rather than merely reading about it, these remain hallmarks of Gurdjieff's style, rarely seen in other spiritual circles of his time. Chapter 14. Reflecting on Childhood Roots. Gurdjieff never forgot the songs his father sang, the dramatic theatricality of the Caucasus, and the glimpses of hidden wisdom he first sensed in the cradle of Alexandropol. In recounting his early life in meetings with remarkable men, he offered not just a nostalgic look at boyhood adventures, but a testament to how the seeds of inquiry can flourish if properly nurtured. He described how his father's storytelling nurtured in him both an appreciation for oral tradition and an awareness of the power of myth to shape the human psyche. In those simple lullabies and epic recitations, Gurdjieff discovered a philosophical bent, realizing that behind folk tales lay symbolic truths about human nature, love, suffering, and cosmic justice. That interplay of personal experience, cultural tradition, and an almost quixotic search for something more would characterize Gurdjieff's approach to teaching for the rest of his life. His father's presence seemed to live on in him. Many noted the gentle paternal aspect Gurdjieff occasionally showed, contrasting with his otherwise intimidating persona. Chapter 15. The ongoing influence of Gurdjieff's work. Decades after Gurdjieff's passing, his ideas continue to percolate through various facets of modern culture. The self-help industry, certain strands of psychotherapy, and even contemporary dance and theater have all, at times, drawn from Gurdjieff's emphasis on self-awareness and embodiment. Psychological insights, psychotherapists from Carl Jung to Fritz Perls, took note of Gurdjieff's holistic view of personality. Although Jung never fully endorsed Gurdjieff, parallels between their insights on the unconscious archetypes and the integrated self are striking. Enneagram. Though Gurdjieff's original work on the Enneagram symbol was somewhat cryptic, it later emerged in the West as a personality typology. However, many contemporary Enneagram schools diverge significantly from Gurdjieff's original, more esoteric usage of the symbol as a cosmic diagram for transformation. Music and dance. Gurdjieff movements groups continue to stage performances around the globe, demonstrating the sacred dances he introduced. Musicians and composers occasionally draw from the Gurdjieff de Hartmann music for inspiration, recognizing its capacity to evoke haunting introspection and a sense of the sublime. Philosophical discourse. Among New Age thinkers and transpersonal psychologists, Gurdjieff is often invoked as a pioneer who bridged East and West. Yet his methodology and warnings against intellectual vanity have also kept him somewhat outside the mainstream. Chapter 16. Revisiting the Meetings with Remarkable Men. Meetings with Remarkable Men remains one of the prime resources for understanding the early shaping of Gurdjieff's character. Published posthumously, it was edited and prepared for publication largely by Jean de Salzmann and other close associates, who strove to maintain Gurdjieff's original style and intent. In the text, readers encounter colorful portraits of individuals like Father Borsch, the spiritual father who gave Gurdjieff important insights into the Christian Orthodox tradition. Dean Evlissi, a figure bridging conventional faith and esoteric wisdom, Prince Lubavetsky, a seeker who joined Gurdjieff in perilous quests and financed some early expeditions. Boguchevsky, the pseudo-Baptist, a contrarian figure who questioned dogmatic religion, spurring Gurdjieff to refine his own questions. Each of these figures symbolizes a particular aspect of knowledge or approach to life. be it unwavering devotion, intellectual curiosity, or the drive for direct spiritual experience. The interplay among them set the stage for the man Gurdjieff would become. He learned resilience from their failings and gleaned deeper insights through their strengths. Their existence confirmed his suspicion that remarkable men, those who had the spark of authenticity, were scattered across all walks of life. They served as living proof that a deeper way of being was possible. Chapter 17. Story of a Tireless Wanderer. If there is a single motif running throughout the tapestry of Gurdjieff's life, it is the motif of wandering. From the dusty roads of Central Asia to the smoky parlors of St. Petersburg, from the ancient ruins of Ani to the modern bustle of New York City, Gurdjieff presented himself as a man who never ceased to travel, externally and internally. He saw life as a journey of discovery, a hiropasa, a term he coined in Beelzebub's tales, signifying the purposeful crossing of thresholds. For Gurdjieff, the greatest threshold was within. The external journeys, trekking through mountains, forging friendships and alliances, merely mirrored the internal quest to awaken from the illusions of the ego. Chapter 18. The Man, the Myth, the Mystery. In the later years of his life, Gurdjieff would often deflect personal questions with humor or a cryptic remark. He enjoyed telling tall tales, blending mythic imagery with mundane anecdotes until it was impossible to discern the boundary between reality and parable. Pupils frequently found themselves confused yet fascinated, as if each conversation was a puzzle box containing deeper insights. This approach was deliberate. Gurdjieff believed that people too eagerly latch onto fixed beliefs. By constantly challenging and even bewildering his listeners, he sought to keep their minds fluid and searching. This style of teaching, though effective in some ways, contributed to the aura of enigma that still surrounds him. Even the basic facts of his birth date, the exact timeline of his journeys, and certain details of his biography remain somewhat disputed among historians. Chapter 19. Continuation of the work in modern times. Since Gurdjieff's death, numerous groups have carried on his methods, though with varying degrees of fidelity and interpretation. Among the more prominent are the official Gurdjieff foundations in Paris, New York, and London, established under the direction of Jean de Salzmann. Many second-generation pupils, like Michel de Salzmann, Henri Tracol, John Pentland, and William Siegel, took on leadership roles. They continued to lead movements classes, reading groups, and retreats, attempting to preserve Gurdjieff's emphasis on inner attention amid everyday tasks. Over time, some have questioned whether a living teacher is needed to inject the same dynamic energy Gurdjieff provided. Others maintain that the line of transmission, guided by the principles set forth by Gurdjieff, remains sufficient for serious seekers. Chapter 20. Concluding Reflections. The Legacy of a Remarkable Man. Today, more than a century after Gurdjieff first began assembling his seekers of truth, his teaching persists. It has weathered political upheavals, wars, social revolutions, and the rapidly shifting landscape of spiritual and psychological theory. While new religions and spiritual trends come and go with the times, Gurdjieff's work retains a certain magnetism for those who sense that modern life lacks depth and authenticity. It is fitting to conclude by circling back to Gurdjieff's own reflections on his childhood in the pages of Meetings with Remarkable Men. There, amid anecdotes of youthful exploration in the Caucasus, we witness the seeds of a life driven by an unquenchable thirst for understanding human existence. The ragged edges of his biography, the unanswered questions, the controversies, do not obscure the luminous core, that he was a man who dedicated himself tirelessly to the art of awakening human potential. In him, we see the embodiment of a principle he articulated. Life is real only then, when I am. That statement can be read as a riddle, a command, or an invitation. For Gurdjieff, it was all three. And so the story of George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, boy minstrel's son from Alexandropol, tireless wanderer, teacher of dances and spiritual provocateur, continues to echo. His disciples and successors, the labyrinthine halls of his writings, and the whispers of those early childhood songs, all converge in a single question that remains as urgent now as ever. How can a person truly awaken to the reality of their own being? In the end, Gurdjieff's life stands as an answer in progress, an ongoing call for those who heed it to venture beyond the mechanical lull of daily life, just as he once ventured beyond Alexandropol in search of remarkable men, hidden monasteries, and ultimately the hidden depths of the human soul.